This video is a quick introduction to the theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral theory, and my main aims in this video are first to show you how that theory relates to a broader family of moral theories, and then to distinguish different varieties of utilitarianism that all fall under that broader family. So, the family that utilitarianism is a member of, you could call the consequentialist family of moral theories. Utilitarianism, it's very important to remember, is just one important and fairly prominent example of a member of that family. What is a consequentialist moral theory, focusing on at the family level now? All consequentialists have in common a shared strategy for how to answer the question, what makes an action right or wrong? Their answer is always, look at the consequences. Are the consequences of that action good or bad? And just based upon answering that question, the goodness or badness of the consequences, they're going to give you the answer to the question whether or not the action is right or wrong. Now, one concern you might have about this way of answering that question, what makes an action right or wrong, is notice that we use the terms good and bad, effectively evaluative terms. We're getting at the concept of things being better or worse when doing this consequentialist style evaluation. Now, we were trying to answer a moral question, a question about rightness and wrongness, and you might have hoped that we would not use other moral language in giving our answer. We've, in effect, shifted from questions about right and wrong to questions about good and bad. And you might be skeptical that that's really very satisfactory progress. People argue about what's right and wrong. Mightn't they also argue about what's good and bad? Well, this is now a nice way that you can organize the different members of the consequentialist family by how exactly do they fill out a detailed, adequate answer to the question, what makes a consequence good or bad? And utilitarians, in particular, they answer by saying, utility is the only thing that makes consequences good or bad. What we want are consequences that contain lots of utility, that's good, and when they contain relatively less utility than other consequences, then that's relatively bad. Okay, well, that's told you in schematic terms what utilitarianism is, but what is this thing, utility? Let me start by giving you some informal explanations of what utility might be. It's roughly something like the idea of well-being or welfare, or what makes a life go well, just for one individual, or happiness. All of those, I think, are reasonably good approximations at the basic idea that a utilitarian is interested in. But the problem is, those are all terms that are somewhat ambiguous or vague or disputed in exactly what they mean. They're not precise terms. They're terms from everyday English where different people might have slightly different understandings. Because utilitarians are trying to develop a particularly precise moral theory, they're not going to be satisfied with leaving it imprecise in that way. They want to try and come up with a technical term. And so that's why they use the word utility. To clarify, we have something more precise than those everyday terms of language like happiness, welfare, and so on. Now, having clarified that utilitarians want to use a precise technical term, it actually turns out there are a number of different ways you can precisely clarify what we mean by utility, and that actually leads to the different varieties within utilitarianism. Two particularly important varieties that we're going to focus on here are the classical variety and the preference variety. But note, they are by no means the only types of utilitarian. There's another sort, for instance, negative utilitarianism, that you might like to look up in your own time. But let's turn to classical utilitarianism. This is a view famously associated with the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries. His central idea is that utility has two components: the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. So, we should be thinking, when trying to think about how much utility does a given outcome or consequence contain, we should have a look at the experiences of people and observe how much pleasure do people have in those experiences? And if there's another consequence where they have more pleasure, well, then the other consequence has more utility. Or we should at the same time as looking at the pleasure, we should also look at how much pain there is. And if one outcome has a high level of pain and the other outcome has less pain, then there is more utility when there is less pain. Note then, on this view, utility of an individual is always experienced by that individual person. Because utility consists in pleasant or painful experiences, you can't very well have a change in your utility state without there being a change in what you experience. So, at least for your own utility, you always, in some sense, know what's going on. You can't have your utility change without you being aware of it. That's going to turn out to be an important contrast to the other type of utilitarianism. The second variety of utilitarianism is preference utilitarianism. This view has been defended by a number of people, but a good example for our purposes is Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher born in the mid-20th century and, at time of recording, working at Princeton University. On this view, utility is simply about the satisfaction of our desires or our wants or our wishes. Or, let's use one catch-all phrase to bring them all together, our preferences. Now, there's still some further refinements possible here. Some people might say it's only a certain class of preferences, your considered ones, the ones you most value on reflection or something like that. But we don't need to get too into those details just now. Let me give you a little example to illustrate, very straightforwardly. So let's say I have two desires at the moment that are frustrated. One desire is to have a shiny red car. Instead, I have a rather ordinary white car. And I also have a preference that my roof stop leaking. Every time it rains heavily, my roof leaks. Now, given that, I have other preferences, of course. These aren't my only ones. Let's say my other preferences, by and large, are satisfied. So how could my utility change? Well, it could change because you frustrate one of the preferences that I currently have satisfied. You could, for instance, make a loud, screechy noise, and I prefer quiet while I'm making these recordings. And so if you make a loud, screechy noise, you'll frustrate my preference for quiet. That would lower my utility. You could increase my utility by satisfying one of my currently frustrated preferences. So you could give me a shiny red car, and that would increase my utility. Pretty straightforward. One quirky feature of this view, though, which distinguishes it from the classical view, and I must admit isn't relevant in most everyday scenarios, but turns out to be relevant in some of the thought experiments that philosophers use to think about the implications of utilitarianism, particularly around life and death issues. This feature is changes in utility are not always directly experienced on the preference view. Let me illustrate with the example of my preference for a roof that doesn't leak. Suppose while I'm at work, you sneak off to my home and try and do a nice thing for me. You try and fix my roof, and you succeed. You completely fix the roof so it no longer leaks. But then you're very modest, so you don't tell me about it. It doesn't rain today, it doesn't rain tomorrow. It's in fact some time before I realize, you know what? A whole heap of rain came down and my roof didn't leak at all. That's wonderful news. At that point, I feel great, right? I have pleasant experiences and so on. But when did my utility change according to the preference utilitarian? My preference was to have a roof that does not leak. And you satisfied that preference. You gave me a roof that does not leak earlier on the day when I was at work when I had no idea what was going on. So my utility increased without me being aware of it. So that's just something important to bear in mind. Finally, I'd like to clarify something about the way a utilitarian makes their claim about the nature of value. So the way I said it earlier was utilitarians think that utility is the only thing of value, the only thing that makes consequences good or bad. Probably an even more precise, more helpful way to put it would be to say utilitarians say that utility is the only thing of ultimate value. What's the point I'm making by stressing that word ultimate? Well, the key idea is this. Sometimes we want to talk about things having value even when they're not the sorts of states that directly involve utility. So for instance, I might say that it's a good idea to floss your teeth, or Simpson is a good chef, or that is a good painting. Now, ideas, chefs, and paintings are not themselves pleasant or unpleasant experiences, nor are they in and of themselves satisfactions or frustrations of preferences. So if a utilitarian wants to make these claims, and they seem common sense, they want to be able to say that all sorts of things can be valuable, they need to explain why these things are valuable in terms of their impact ultimately upon utility. So for instance, we can say it's a good idea to floss your teeth because, well, you'll tend to experience more utility if you floss your teeth and therefore get fewer cavities and therefore have less pain or have fewer of your preferences frustrated. Or Simpson is a good chef. Why? Well, he tends to make meals, and those meals, when consumed, lead to pleasant experiences or lead to the satisfaction of preferences. Or why is that a good painting? Because owning it or looking at it tends to cause high utility states. Those don't need to be the exact translations that a utilitarian would subscribe to, but something along those lines is what they must be committed to, and that's why they say utility is the only thing of ultimate value. It's the thing that lies at the end of our explanations of why one thing or another is good or bad.